Hi, this is Tim Grant again, and this is part two of my Bravo deck tech kind of discussion video series for the first place Bravo deck that I piloted at a recent Road to Nationals. So, in the first video, we went over basically just what's in the deck, the core of the deck, and then the sideboard, and some of the alternative cards that people are using, and I didn't run in this deck, and just basically why I picked a bunch of this stuff. Part two is mainly going into piloting the deck. Um, this is not the only way to play Bravo. Just like I said in the first video, there's no one way to play any hero or play the game. You do whatever you want. This is just how I pilot it and the lines of play and the tactics that I'm trying to do to win the game. So if you have a different style or a different setup, that's great. I'm just hoping this video is kind of informational on just how I play it. Maybe you can pull some tips and tricks out of it for your games. So the main goal of how I run this deck is primarily it's kind of a control deck. It's mostly control, but I'm also trying to pivot into basically kind of attack mode where I'm trying to drain cards from my opponent. Um, a lot of the disruptive attacks like Crippling Crush, Spinal Crush, Command and Conquer, Disable, and the Pummels are trying to pull cards out of my opponent's hand, and pull them out of their deck. Um, Basically, it's trying to be as disruptive as possible. And when you're pulling cards out of their deck or forcing them to block and respecting the hit effects, that means their counterattacks back at you are just much less potent, so you can usually block with one or two cards and be fine, and then just keep going up with pressure. So the first part of just playing kind of any control deck, or especially this deck, is when you're on the back foot, which is going to be most of the game. You're in basically defensive mode. You need to be okay with dumping three to even four cards into just blocking, which is why most of the cards in this deck are block threes. The notable ones that aren't are Pummels, the Energy Potion, the Remembrance, and the Rouse of the Ancients. Those are the cards that block two is slightly worse than the threes. It's not a huge deal, but most of the deck is trying to be three or better. So that way you can reliably do the math in your head of um, every card is kind of worth a block three, and you should be ready to basically dump two to three cards a turn into stopping whatever your opponent's doing and trying to preserve that life total while you wait for your pivot cards or your big crush attacks. So you just have to be fine with that. Um, I prefer to just be very proactive with just hammering. So I know there's a lot of cards out there of people just want to always show time. You always want to stamp. Um, this is why I like Blessing and Deliverance, where I can always be throwing out a hammer. Just even the slightest bit of pressure, getting one extra card out of their hand, or they just let the four through, it's still fine. Um, Kind of letting your opponent just go in with a five card hand. Uh, it's basically like a game of solitaire where it turns into, all right, they have their whole hand and you have four. So all they have to do is figure out how do I get above 12, which is basically your hand. Um, and there's one particular matchup which is chain where that can actually the game just kind of devolves into that sometimes. But that's I don't particularly like just kind of sitting there and taking that the entire game. I like to just constantly throw out hammers if they're fours or sixes with a blessing or a surge token into the hammer for six. Just trying to keep some kind of pressure up. It can be just a little bit, but basically when you're hammering, those cards are coming back in the later of the game. And if they're blocking, you're removing a card out of their deck. So their deck should be slightly dwindling while yours is also dwindling while blocking. But you always want to be removing something from their deck. So that means you can even start throwing out crippling crushes without dominate, command and conquer, just flat out with no pummel. You're just trying to disrupt their game plan and make it so they're later in the game their threats aren't as potent. And then also with that, when you're in defensive mode, is identifying what attacks you have to stop. So like you're playing against a Dorinthia and they play Steel Blade. supremacy, you know you're taking your entire hand and blocking it, unless you've got an amazing like follow up 1-2 of like double crippling crush. Just watching what your opponent's doing and knowing that even though you might have a pivot turn or you might be on the aggressive side, if they come back at you with something huge, don't be afraid to just dump your hand and stop it. Because we also run like, or at least I'm running one remembrance or two in the board if it's like control. So I will be fine actively throwing away a crippling crush, a command and conquer or something, and just using it to block. That's fine because we know we're going to get them back in the end game. So that's basically the bread and butter of the game, where most of the time you're going to be kind of on the back foot, holding them back and hammering and just chipping away at their life. The concept of pivoting, I don't know if it's an actual like game term, but kind of that's how I coined it. Is pivoting is going from that hammer defensive mode into attack mode with action cards. So when you're hammering, you're just pitching cards, recycling them, and using cards to defend with. So those are going out of your deck. When you're in attack mode, you're basically just using your attack action cards. And so pivoting is kind of how you get from being on the back foot to uh, attacking with a bunch of cards. So when you're on the back foot, you're usually dumping two, three, maybe even four cards a turn into stopping what they're doing. Pivoting is where, how I kind of call it, where we switch tempo. Where now I'm the one that's doing that to them. So now they have to respect all my on hit triggers and my crushes, and they're dumping 2 to 3 cards a turn, trying to just not lose even more tempo or lose key cards out of their hand or key cards out of their arsenal. So pivoting usually comes around with the command and conquers, the disables, spinal crush a lot of the time if it's not like a blowout, and the pummels. So it's usually trying to find a 1-2 kind of 1-2 punch setup where you've got a cheap effective card that they have to respect. So a command and conquer, and then you can bluff a pummel with it, or you throw out or disable off a search token, and you're floating two. So now they're terrified of if there's a pummel behind it. You don't always need to dominate it unless you're really just trying to just chip in for damage. You're trying to force them into dumping more cards from their hand to stop your on hit effect or your crush. So if you're just throwing out a yellow disable, they need to be throwing at least a defense reaction for four, or they're throwing in 2 cards, or they're throwing in a card and an equipment, which is great. And you're just trying to pull stuff out of their hands, so now they're the ones that are dumping more resources to block you, and then you keep up with pressure and just kind of keep hammering away with command and conquerors and disables and all your crushes. The main thing about pivoting that I found is it's not an on-off switch that happens once a game, or at least how I play it. I'm not usually trying to pitch my big crushes and then have a big turn order at the end of the game where it's just back to back to back to back based on my pitch order. I'm usually trying to disrupt my opponent by throwing these cards out with a little bit of pummel backup, or just throwing crippling crushes and spinal crushes, trying to draw stuff out of them and make their deck worse. That make it worse off. Because if I'm just trying to hammer and set up a huge just string of crushes at the end, you may not always get there depending on who it is. And it may be that you're giving up so much kind of tempo and life by just like blocking and then hammering that they can afford to take one of these big crush attacks and then just come back and kill you. So that's just how I've found that to play out. I'm not really huge on just pitching this crazy order of like Crippling Crush and 3 blues. I'm more just trying to pull stuff out of my opponent and get them to ditch cards so their deck's worse, and then I can push through damage at the end. So the other thing with just pivoting is that you kind of want them to be relatively cheap. So cheap for Bravo is usually pitching 2 cards. I know that it's different for a lot of different heroes, but Disable is kind of the big one where it's pitch 2 cards and then you can get a surge token rolling and throw the disable at them, and they have to deal with it. Um, Especially if you throw out a dominated one. Which is also why I run Command and Conquerors, because it's now something that they have to respect, and you can do it off 2 cards. And one of the key parts to pivot turns or getting into the pivots is keeping a Seismic Surge token rolling. So always having that out and always having that option. It's really awkward when you want to kind of go into aggro mode or you want to just throw something at them and you don't have a surge token out. Um, that's kind of why I like some of these fives, where if I don't have the token, basically I just didn't have the resources for it, or the turn before was kind of awkward, I can still throw these out there and make a surge token and they have to deal with it. Where if I was doing something like a ton of righteous cleansings, now if I don't have the surge token and I throw the cleansing out, um, usually I'm not making another surge on top of that. I'm usually dominating it, so that takes up the whole hand. So that's 7 + 2 for the dominate, so that's 9. So you're pitching 3 cards to pull that off, and so you don't get the surge token to go into the next one. So I'm always trying to keep a surge token rolling for when those turns come up and I'm ready to throw something at someone. So that's pivoting in a nutshell. It's never kind of once a game that you go from defense mode into attack mode, or at least for me, it's always kind of this like back and forth ebb and flow of I'm attacking 2, 3, 4 times, and then maybe I get a bad hand, and I just come in with a hammer, and then they can kind of breathe again, and then you're on the back foot, defending a bit, and then go right back into it. So it's less on the string of attacks at the end of just hitting them turn after turn after turn, because that takes a while to set up. I'm looking for basically kind of a mid-game setup where it's attack 2, 3 times in a row and then back off and then set up again and go back into it. So that's kind of how I define pivoting. This last section is just kind of lines of play on what I'm usually looking for when I'm playing this deck. Um, People play all sorts of different ways, so this is just kind of how I do it. So the first one is just hammer spam with Anothos. Um, it's fine swinging for 4. Like, if you have something in hand, like Stamp, Blessing, Showtime, it's fine throwing those in Arsenal and then just coming in for 4. The only time that, or actually it's a lot of the time, but the time that I'm coming in for 6 is usually when I'm trying to just keep a Seismic Surge token rolling. That's honestly more important to me than kind of coming in for 2 extra all the time. Like if I'm taking a bunch of extra damage just to push 2 extra, it it's not that worth it to me. I just don't mind coming in for 4. They're still either going to just take the 4 or block it with 1 card or maybe even 2. So it's fine. It doesn't seem that amazing, but it's still fine. Just kind of block 3 cards, throw a hammer at them, kind of wait for those, wait for your pivot cards, and leverage your arsenal. The next one is Blessing and Deliverance. So the big thing with Blessing Red is because this isn't a life gain card, in my opinion. I look at this as attack 6, gain X life, and then based on averages for this deck, in the beginning to mid game, it's on average worth 2 health, and then if you're recycling with Remembrance, it's almost guaranteed a 3 because your deck is pretty much all 3s at that point. So it's really a hammer for 6, gain maybe 2 life on the next turn, and it thins your draw a little bit, and you're trying to basically use it to upgrade your arsenal. I run the reds just because I'm expecting to play them when I see them, or I'm expecting to block with them when I see them. If you're running blues, usually that's you're okay with pitching them and then seeing them later in the game, and kind of keeping up hammer spam. I run the reds because if I see them and I don't have anything else that's going on, I use them and then hammer for 6 gain 2. And if nothing's really going on or I need to preserve the rest of my hand, I'll just block for 3. Like, it's 3 life still, so I'm completely fine with that. It's also tip for playing Blessing and Deliverance is you play the Blessing first and pitching the the blue three and have one floating and see what you draw next before you um, before you do anything. Uh, what I see a lot of people do is they'll surge first and then they'll blessing, and they're just assuming that they're going to hit that next blue for the hammer. Um, that law of probability or probability says that's not always going to happen, which is also why I run a couple yellows. So if I throw out the blessing, I whiff and I actually get a yellow. I'll have one floating, and then I can still pitch the yellow and come in with a hammer. Um, and if I whiff real bad, or if actually, let's say I blessing a deliverance, it's mid game to late game. I blessing a deliverance, and I draw like crippling crush, and I want to arsenal it, or I want to hold on to it, rather than just pitching it and trying to just do something else or throwing out surge. I'll actually just use the floater and pop the helm. So then now I drew my big crush effect. I can get it into my arsenal or hold on to it, and then I go up to 5 int. So now I got a full grip ready to go for a big swing. So those are some lines of play with Blessing of Deliverance. So because it's red, I'm looking to play it whenever I draw it, or I'm blocking with it whenever I draw it. I still like the blues, but it just doesn't really work with kind of what I'm doing on just trying to pressure out cards. Uh, the big line of play that most of the game's going to kind of revolve around is, I guess, a pivot into a haymaker or a double haymaker. So if you're thinking about boxing or just a fight in general, usually you're throwing like haymakers or your big swings. So that's your crippling crush, your spinal crush. Those are the time walks that I was talking about in the first video, or a command and conquer into a pummel, which is basically like another crippling crush. So when you're pivoting or looking for a pivot, usually you're throwing out something like disables or command and conquer flat, or even like a spinal crush flat, and trying to draw cards out from your opponent and draw out their defenses so they have less to come back with, or less to stop what you're going to come back with on the second turn. So it'll be like command and conquer, they ditch 2 cards, maybe even 3, and I have a crippling crush in arsenal. And then the next turn, you just come in with a crippling crush dominate. So that's another turn that they lose, and they've already dumped. Ideally, they've dumped like a defense reaction or something into your pivot card. So disable or spinal, you're just trying to get those out of the way to clear a path for your crippling crush or your spinal crush. So it's kind of a key thing is I'll throw out the disables, the command and conquers like rouse and just hammer, just trying to get cards out of my opponent. Um, Sometimes I'll just throw a spinal crush just to get cards out of them, but really the crippling crush is waiting for 2 things in a row. So it'll be like 2 crippling crushes in a row, or command and conquer and a crippling crush, or disable and a crippling crush. Um, that double haymaker is really where that you're pivoting into attack mode. You hit them really hard and pull stuff out of their hand, pull stuff out of their deck, and then you hold on to that tempo as long as you can. And then once you run out of gas, you might back off back in the hammer mode. Um, Usually, just throwing out a crippling crush dominate, it usually just gonna run into a defense reaction. Uh, which is fine if you're planning on it, but if you're expecting this to just always crush or always get through, it just doesn't happen. Especially if just playing as players who know Bravo, they're going to be holding on to their unmovables. They'll be holding on to Sink Below and Arsenal, waiting for that crippling crush so they can throw a card from hand, throw an equipment at it, and then throw out a defense reaction and stop the crush effect and preserve their hand. So it's not always an expectation that your crushes are going to go through early to mid game. Late game is really where you're just kind of pushing your crush effects through. Um, Next section, just some strong openers. I always like going first, pretty much in every matchup. I mean, even kind of a dash matchup. I just like going first where I can kind of set up and go into the next turn. So usually it'll be like surge into stamp authority is huge because now it's You got the ball rolling, and you got 5 int, plus you get something in Arsenal. Surge into Showtime. Um, really strong when you're kind of going aggro on someone. Is a great first turn opener. Um, the random 1 in 100 Towering Titan on turn one is really good, but it just doesn't happen that often because you have to have Towering Titan and 3 other blues. Um, the odds of that are pretty low. It's very rare that I ever get to Towering Titan. Even in the first turn is probably the only time that I really do it safely. The rest of the game I kind of ignore it, except for maybe dash. Uh, Energy Potion is the next one. That's a great first turn. Uh, it's also, I'll just kind of sidebar as to how I play Energy Potion. Uh, I have one in the deck, and it's specifically just for turning on future pummels. So showing a pummel is kind of obvious, especially like on Command and Conquers and disables. Like you're floating two, or you have 2 cards in hand, or one in hand, one in arsenal. Your opponent is going to expect a pummel. Um, what they won't expect is if you just have nothing in hand, 1 card in arsenal, but you actually have an energy potion out on board. Now they're I've caught plenty of people not thinking there's a pummel coming, and then you just energy potion and blow them out with the pummel. Uh, so that's the reason that I run it. And then getting it out on the field is um, usually against those matchups where I'm blocking with 2 to 3 cards a turn, and then all I have to come back with is a hammer, usually for 4 or for 6. Having the one energy potion is basically giving up a hammer swing um, to block with 3 cards, and then just ending my turn with an energy potion, and then drawing back up. And now it just makes any kind of freebie card or lone card in your hand or arsenal suddenly looks like a pummel to your opponent. I only run the one just because it's a liability in the end game if you're blocking. Um, it's great because it pitches for 3, but if you don't use it um, kind of early to mid game or get it set, it actually kind of becomes a liability in the end game. So that's why I only have the one. Um, and then another just great first turn play is just arsenaling and passing. Leveraging your arsenal is a huge thing for this deck, and just playing cards out of the arsenal and knowing, um, kind of just leveraging the arsenal, upgrading it, and setting up your future turns. So even if it doesn't seem like much, just running out a surge token and then arsenaling something like a pummel or just any of your decent cards is actually really big because you pitched for the surge token, so that's 1 card out of your hand, and now you're arsenaling one of your good cards. So you holding on to 2 and then drawing 2 more. So you basically get to call your hand and mulligan it until for your next turn, and set up to kind of keep up a tempo game if you're just basically starting out on like a pivot. Um, but the next section I have is just, I call them naked or flat crush attacks. So just throwing out your big crushes without dominate, um, which is perfectly fine, especially in the early game. I'm not dominating every single attack I can. Sometimes it's not worth it sometimes. So like on the disable, even when I have a surge token rolling, um, so it'll cost 4 when I throw out the disable. If you pitch 2, and then you're attacking with the disable, floating 2 resources. Let's say you have a card in hand or a card in arsenal. Now your opponent has to change their math from, do I have to block um, do I have to block for 5 to stop the crush effect, or do I have to block for, in this case, 7 to 8 or even 9 to just stop a crush effect plus a pummel. It changes the math in their head a ton. Um, so that's kind of why it's fine just not dominating. So throwing out, like in a matchup against like Bravo, I'm probably not dominating a Spinal Crush. I will just throw the 9 out, and if they want to let it through, it'll just turn off the Bravo or a Surge token, just because they lose go again, so they can't tech plate. But I'll just throw it out there, make a Surge token, and just throw it out there for costing 5. And this is if I don't have a Surge token rolling. Sometimes you actually just don't want to dominate. It's fine. just to keep your surge tokens rolling. So if you have a surge and pay 4 for the spinal and then 2 for the dominate, now you, unless you have an extra card in hand, you're just pitching that for the surge for some reason. Um, you're losing out on keeping the surge token rolling for something big, like if you're actually doing a pummel or a crippling crush. So it, not saying that there's a right or wrong way to always dominate your attacks. It's just, it's okay throwing stuff out flat, like throwing out a command and conquer and just bluffing pummel. It's perfectly fine if you don't pummel it. It still pulls 2 cards out of their hand, and ideally there's something good. And if they don't respect the pummel, then you can just blow them out with a command and conquer into a pummel. And the last section on just how I'm playing the deck, and then I'll just do another broad overview, is leveraging the arsenal. So everything in the deck that you're usually playing is very expensive. So using that extra card slot in the arsenal is actually gigantic on just making the deck run. So putting stuff in your arsenal either to find your pivot turns, which if you're on the defensive, usually it's the defense reaction on something like Bravo or Dory. Sync belows are great in there just because you can block with them and then cycle away cards in your hand. Other stuff is really good in there is just Blessing of Deliverance, so you just sit it in there and then use it when you're ready, and you're kind of upgrading your arsenal. And then a lot of the time you're just hammering away with your blues, so it's just your hammer spam, and you finally hit a Spinal Crush or a Crippling Crush or even a Command and Conquer. Instead of just immediately playing it, work it into your arsenal, and then you wait for the second crush or the second attack. So you're doing that double haymaker. That's usually the biggest way that I'm leveraging the arsenal, is putting a big attack in there and then waiting for the second one to show up. If I'm just playing them as I see them, it kind of just, you're attacking cards out of your opponent, but you're not really putting them on the back foot. It's kind of just medium, kind of hitting them for a medium amount of damage or medium hit effects just kind of randomly. The big stuff is when you're doing 2 in a row. So use that arsenal, put your crushes in there, and save them, or put your pummels in there and save them, and then set up for that 1-2 punch. And a lot of that's going to be about your matchup. So what you prioritize will definitely change based on who you're playing against and what the game state is. So if it's trying to outlast, like you're getting pummeled in a Bravo mirror, you're usually going to be trying to get defense reactions in there, just to stave off the crush effects. Or if it's like Rhinar, you're trying to put in your zero cost defense reactions to get around the barraging beatdown intimidate combo. Or you're doing stuff like putting in Rouse the Ancients if you're going aggro, because it's really hard to play that just out of your hand. If you're going full aggro, then Rouse the Ancients actually is pretty good putting it in the arsenal. The other major thing about just putting stuff in your arsenal is don't be afraid to cycle it out if it's not as effective. Like it's not a full 4 block. Don't be afraid to cycle it out and quote unquote upgrade your arsenal. So like if someone's coming at you for 3, and you really want to get that crippling crush in the arsenal, but it's you may not think, oh, it's not worth throwing a sink below because that's just a 3. It actually might be, just to get it out of your arsenal to clear up space to get the crippling crush in and set up that way. So just don't be afraid to toss it out there. And it's the same with like, let's say you command and conquer and you're just not finding the second attack, or you just got to get it out of there to put something else in. Just don't be afraid to fire it off and just get it out of the arsenal, and then basically upgrade your arsenal and use that extension of your hand as best you can. That's kind of the biggest thing with playing with this deck and then using the arsenal, is just don't be afraid to just get rid of something in there and change it out. So this is kind of the core of how I play the deck. I mean, mostly going after cards in their hand, cards in their arsenal, trying to get stuff out of my opponent's deck. and weathering the storm on their major threats. So it's watching what they're playing, identifying when I need to just dump my entire hand or a majority of my hand and just let them come at me with a bunch of stuff and block it out. So then those threatening cards are out of their deck and I don't have to worry about them, and it's actually safer for me to start throwing in pivot cards. So just don't be afraid to. You got a pivot turn ready, or you got a disable and a pummel, and you're ready to go, and they come at you with something super scary. It's fine if you just toss out that pivot card or toss out those cards just to block it out and survive, and then wait for another one, another set of pivot cards or attack cards to come along. It's fine. So that's how basically I play this Bravo deck. So the first video is just kind of the deck tech. Second video is how I kind of play it, and then in the next video I'm just going to go through the 12 major matchups and just what I plan for and how I play them. There's no one way to play each matchup either, so it's going to be changing as you go through it. But I figured I'll give you a brief overview of how I sideboard for them and then how I play them. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.